Columbus became famous for his discoveries, specifically the discovery that you can discover a continent with millions of people already living on it that had also been visited by Vikings around 500 years earlier. In fact, many U.S. states and cities no longer recognize Columbus Day, raising the question, why do the rest of us still do it? America's least favorite holiday commemorates a murderous egomaniac whose most famous discovery was a case of getting lost and refusing to ask directions. All of which is enough to make you wonder, Columbus Day, how is this still a thing?
I will tell you why we recognize Columbus, regardless as to whether or not he deserves a holiday named after him. Don't think he really does. It's because Columbus gets lost, and in the process, he blunders into the modern world. So welcome through the almighty power of Ferdinand Foch, or Chomper Rice, or the Ulama Lama, or maybe even just plain old Genghis Khan, you have survived Unit 1. So now we're moving into Unit 2, and Unit 2 is generally defined as running from 1450 all the way to around 1750. And what we call this is the early modern world. So what makes it modern, other than it being slightly closer to our own time in the 21st century? Well, look at this map. If you look at this map, what you're going to see is that major global power concentrates around places like China, India, Mesopotamia, and Turkey. And of course, if we were to go back a few thousand years ago, let's say to around 2000 or so BCE, you would find that in contrast, major global power would concentrate around China and India and Mesopotamia / Anatolia. Yeah. They say history is cyclical, but sometimes it just seems absolutely static. This has been the norm of global history, by the way. So where power is divided between basically the same civilizations that sort of first developed civilization in the first place. China, India, and, of course, Mesopotamia / Anatolia, etc. If there was one continent you could be sure wasn't going places, you could be pretty sure that's Europe. And by the way, Europe has pretty much always been that way. Europe is a peninsula that juts out of the Eurasian landmass, and it really hasn't had much that's distinguished it. Yes, it had a Roman Empire that lasted from approximately depending on when you date the foundation of Rome, 753 to 476. 753 BCE to 476 CE. But it really only managed to sustain itself by dominating most of North Africa and a considerable chunk of the Middle East, including almost all of Anatolia and the Levant. So there's a pretty interesting story of how after Julius Caesar's death, basically Caesar Augustus and Mark Antony are dividing up the empire between the two of them. Okay, yes, those of you in the comments, yes, I do recognize that Lepidus was also there. But to be honest, like, do third wheels really count here? I don't think they do. Any hoodles. So Antony and Augustus are dividing up the empire, and Antony tries to basically take all the East, and he's like, hey, take France, take Spain, like, take Rome. Those are all the really good places. And Augustus is like, the East is where all the money is. And that's always been the case. Europe was, if you look at the late Roman Empire, Europe was kind of the scene of these roving, marauding bands of what the Romans called barbarians, tribes like the Goths, the Saxons, the Jutes, so on, Huns, so on and so forth. And that's sort of been the norm rather than the exception. Now, Europe experiences a Dark Age and then the Middle Ages, and then it slowly but surely kind of catches up to where the Roman Empire left off. But the themes of centralization that we've been exploring in, for example, Dar al-Islam, or in China, or in India, you don't really have that in Europe. You have a brief flirtation with the restoration of the Roman Empire under Charlemagne until dude dies and unfortunately had made the mistake of having more than one male heir. And then, of course, you have the Holy Roman Empire that, as Voltaire tells us, is neither holy nor Roman nor much of an empire. Rip. If you were a betting person, shame on you if you are, then you could probably bet comfortably that the next 200 to 300 years in this early modern period are going to be a lot like the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. There's probably going to be a big, powerful Chinese dynasty that can practically dwarf the world in population and economic productivity. There's going to be a large power concentrated in India, in Mesopotamia, Turkey, Iran, so on and so forth. But that's not what happens. Because in the early modern period, Europe kind of wakes up and catches up. And you can already see where it does that. It establishes this global empire in the New World. And that's just by about 1750. And by the way, keep in mind that even one of these European empires, like, for example, the Spanish Empire in the New World, it eventually has more territory in the New World than the entire Roman Empire has at its height. And this is just the starting point. This is Europe on the eve of the cataclysm called World War I. So if you look at it, basically, depending upon how you measure it, anywhere from 80 to 90% of the surface of planet Earth is either directly ruled or indirectly ruled by one of the European empires, with special guest stars, America and Japan. We ended the last unit with the decline of the Mongol Empire, or empires. So the question is, who is now going to be king of the hill now that the Mongol empires are basically no more? Well, if you haven't been able to figure out the context clues, it's, mirrored Europe. So the Mongol Empire dominates 33% of the planet, but Europe collectively dominates 80 to 90% by around 1914. Now you might say, Mr. Dry, that's not really fair because the Mongols were a monolithic empire, and of course the Europeans are fighting against one another as much as they are non-Europeans. Well, that's only kind of true, because if you remember, the Mongol Khanates also fought with one another. Maybe not as much as the Europeans, but if you think about it from that perspective, that Europe is a collection of empires under sort of a loose civilization, and maybe the Mongols are kind of as well, then in some respects what's happening in Europe is all the more staggering. You go from 33% at the end of the Mongol Empire to over 80 to 90% by 1914. Absolutely just mind-blowing. But just like everything, there is a cost. So this incredible expansion comes at the cost of depopulating nearly 2 entire continents. In just 100 years, spoiler, after the arrival of Columbus to the New World, nearly 90% of the original inhabitants have died due to disease, warfare, or just mistreatment. So that's cost number one. Cost number two is we're going to see a disruption of economic patterns that have existed since, I don't know, the establishment of Göbekli Tepe and the agrarian economy, because with imperialism, we get economic systems like mercantilism, which will gradually be replaced by other models, including capitalism and industrialization. Neither of these things are mutually exclusive, by the way. And the shift to an industrial economy, which overseas imperialism definitely facilitates, is an economic model that is just as dramatic in its newness as the development of agriculture was in and around 10 to 12,000 or so BCE. So that's number two. Number three is a little bit more complicated. So many of these European empires were motivated by the same dreams of universal empire that motivated ancient civilizations like the Romans and even the Assyrians. What's going to happen is that European powers will fight one another on the European continent, but also wherever else in the world they find their opponents. So oftentimes the duel for supremacy in Europe between, let's say, England and France is going to be fought not in England or France, but rather in Canada. Go figure. But that drive for more and more territory and this drive for more and more competition, both economically, militarily, and culturally, it will eventually lead to a series of events that will undermine the very fiction or fantasy or myth that propels them towards universal empire in the first place. And what ultimately that leads to is this century almost of near constant revolution in Europe. And of course, the birth of these two sort of, I don't even want to call them ideologies necessarily, perspectives is probably the best word, liberalism and nationalism. So let's go ahead and pick up. So we have the decline of the Mongol Empire and the emergence of the Ming Dynasty. So what this means is that the Pax Mongolica, which guarantees the free flow of trade, well, it's more like the Bellum Mongolica, the age of Mongols at war. And so the Ming, remember, are much more isolationist. They're sort of more of a return to form for the Chinese. And so the alternative, of course, is for Europeans to turn to the sea in order to satisfy their demand for trade. So if you had to pick a time to start looking outward and expand your international trade, and specifically expanding your merchant marine, in other words, your fleet of boats that can handle international trade, now would be the time, because the demand for it is going to be sky high. So what happens? Well, nobody really does that. For a couple of reasons. So the Arab world is disrupted during this time period. You have the emergence of the Ottoman Empire throughout Anatolia and Mesopotamia. So they're still kind of constituting themselves. They're much more focused on consolidating their power on the European and Asian continents. China, remember, just kind of pieces out of international trade with the emergence of the Ming Dynasty. They have that flirtation under Zheng He with tribute states along the Horn of Africa. But they don't really expand beyond that. Japan has a period called the Warring States that sees the emergence and victory of Tokugawa Ieyasu. But after he wins at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1585, basically he just kicks all the foreigners out, more or less. And so they turn to isolationism, even more radically, actually, than the Ming. So Southeast Asian empires, they're mostly focused on Indian Ocean trade. And in India, you have the Mughal Empire, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but they're going to grow progressively weaker every year. And at this point, there's no major African empire to really experiment with international trade. So the only continent that's left that has the capacity, at least theoretically, to engage in international trade is going to be Europe. And it's in Europe where you have the greatest demand for international trade as well. So why is Europe able to pull this off, and how is Europe able to pull this off? And the answer is complicated. If it were simple, I wouldn't have an entire slide on it. So, firstly, you have a decline in things that had been in existence since really the end of the Roman Empire. The Catholic Church is still kicking, but it's not living its best life right now. From roughly the early 1500s all the way to the early 1700s, it is going to be almost entirely consumed by religious / theological / political questions caused by a really annoying German friar that likes nailing things to bulletin boards. Also, knighthood, knighthood doesn't go away like the Catholic Church. It's still kicking, but knights have lost a lot of their battlefield utility and use. You also see the emergence of large nation states. In France, you have the 100 Years' War, in which you have, France was pretty divided before this. You had different states like Aquitaine, Brittany, Normandy, Calais, that were nominally under control by the French king, but still were functionally, if not actually, independent. By the end of the 100 Years' War, France has come together as a unified whole. The same is true for Spain under the Reconquista that ends in 1492. So you see, like, feudal Europe, which is divided into these, counties and duchies and so on, emerge as nation states. The other thing that's happening is with the emergence of nation states, you have the emergence of national monarchies that are fairly powerful. It depends upon the year, and of course, it depends upon what nation state you're talking about. But the reality is these national monarchies were fairly powerful, and we also associate them with having strong bureaucratic governments with the backing of gunpowder armies. I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say that in Europe you have widespread acceptance of capitalism exactly, partially because I don't think that capitalism in its true form has developed quite yet in either its structure or in theory. But the fact is that Europe tends to be a lot more, pro-trade. And it's pro-trade for a variety of different reasons. We've already seen that because of institutions like the Hanseatic League, and of course the emergence of medieval guilds and that sort of thing. The development of capitalism and trade in Europe is actually an area where Europe's very disunity is to its advantage. Because, of course, if you've ever taken AP Euro or you know anything about European history, it's that the Europeans really don't need much pretext for a good old-fashioned war or conflict. If you've deluded yourself into thinking that old-style European rivalries have gone away, look at any European soccer match, especially between other European nation states. It's pretty intense. So, the fact that you have all of these states constantly competing against one another generally makes trade and commerce a lot more efficient. So if you think about it, if you have a large empire that can basically directly regulate trade, even across the world, like, for example, Ming China can to a certain extent, then you aren't going to face as much, international competition. You have so many trading advantages that even if you embrace trade, which, of course, Ming China did not really, the fact is that you don't really have the incentives to make trade any more or less efficient. Whereas Europeans are constantly jockeying against one another to find better deals, better prices, anything for the English to one up the French, or the Spanish to one up the Portuguese, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, there's a lot of squabbling, and there's probably a lot of waste in that squabbling. But you also get a continent that becomes very economically efficient as a consequence. At the end of the last unit, we had the Song Dynasty. And if you remember, shortly before they were conquered by the Yuan Dynasty, aka the Mongols, they were pretty much the technological, economic, and everything superpower of the world. They had the largest population in the world. They had the largest food yields. They had armies that used gunpowder weapons. They had movable type. They had the compass. Like in some respects, when you think of the Song, think of them, the difference between the Song and everybody else, as the difference between like stereotypical space aliens invading Earth and Earthlings. Like, it's an order of magnitude difference in terms of, well, everything. Um, so the thing is, though, we've got the Silk Road under the Mongols, and that technological superiority, which has been enjoyed by the Chinese for a long period of time, that slowly but surely goes away. So the Europeans independently sort of develop movable type, the printing press, they develop gunpowder weapons, and because they're competing and fighting against each other a heck of a lot more than what you see in China, you actually get more efficient gunpowder weapons that emerge. And the same thing is true for things like the compass and other navigational pieces of technology. Finally, and this might be one of the most important things, you don't have the resource curse. If you remember, the resource curse is that bizarre observation that sometimes you don't want precious shiny metal that you can just extract out of the ground, or valuable resources like oil that you can pump from the soil. The idea of the resource curse is that if your economy revolves around extracting resources from the ground, whether that's gold or silver or cash crops or oil or any of these other things, then why would you need to have something like, I don't know, universities? Why would you need to have people go into trades? The money is, of course, with mining gold or mining silver or drilling for oil or any of these things. And again, oil is not being actively drilled for during this time period. It's sort of an example of a modern resource that provides the resource curse. But we know that, I mean, if you look at a lot of the highest performing economies in the world and look at them based upon per capita income, a lot of times these are in societies that don't have a ton of natural resources. But what they do have in common, usually, is that they have high levels of human capital, where because you don't have areas that have lots and lots of resources, they tend to focus on developing their population and teaching them skills in order to sort of maintain sort of a competitive advantage with other countries or within the same country. Probably the best practical example is if you look at where the first industrial revolution began in the United States, it begins in New England. One of the reasons it begins in New England is because you have a highly educated population with also some navigable rivers, and you have it's densely concentrated because of urbanization. But beforehand, if you looked at where the money in the United States was, it was located in the South, where you had an economy that revolved around cash crops. And as it turns out, focusing your entire economy on cash crops was a benefit in the short term, sort of like steroids, I suppose. But just like steroids, it leads to long-term damage because it's ultimately New England that and the mid-Atlantic states that sort of leaves the South far behind in terms of, overall economic clout. So that's a practical example of the resource curse. So Europeans are having to do other things. They're having to figure out other ways of sort of improving their economies that don't involve resource exploitation. The other thing that Europeans are having to contend with is during the Crusades, they became kind of used to a steady stream of goods like cinnamon and silk and sugar and perfume, jewels, and those kinds of things coming in from East Asia and to a certain extent Southwest Asia. And then all of a sudden they lose that with the decline of the Silk Road. Now, this is another key insight on human behavior. I'm not sure what effect this is, but I'm just going to call it the plasma TV effect. So before I got a plasma TV, I was pretty content with just my regular sort of flat screen TV. I don't really know what you call it. I don't really technology, but I was pretty content with it. And then I upgraded to a plasma TV, and when my plasma TV briefly sort of broke down for a little bit, I had to go back to my regular flat screen. And what I observed is that having gotten used to the plasma TV, I couldn't go back to the regular one because it had changed my expectations. It wasn't real TV anymore. I had to have the plasma TV back. So that's kind of what's happening here. Europeans aren't interested in going back to the way things were. They want their regular goods like cinnamon, silk, sugar, etc. The problem for Europeans, however, is the massive trade deficit that they have with states in East Asia, Indonesia, and India. I don't mean that trade deficit. Although I kind of do, because what you're going to find is that trade deficits with Asia among Western countries, that's not the exception. That's more or less the rule. Has been dating all the way back to, let's say the Judeo-Claudian dynasty of the Roman Empire. So we've already talked about the fact that from the perspective of the Chinese, Western Europe really hasn't ever had anything that they've really wanted. So Europeans aren't able to trade, get silk in exchange for, I don't know, iron or something. I mean, there's plenty of iron in China, for example. So the recourse is that Europeans have to use specie, basically gold or silver, in order to make up the difference. By 1400, there's so much gold and silver that were basically being sent to Asia that it threatened to sort of collapse the European economy that was based upon coinage based primarily in gold. So, yeah, the solution is, of course, to emphasize trade and use trade to sort of make up the difference. And who knows, maybe you can find overseas deposits of gold or silver. So this is where we get new navigational technology or new maritime pieces of technology. So on the one hand, you have new types of ships. So just FYI, most ships before this period of history were pretty garbage. They were pretty garbage because they weren't really designed to go on the open sea. Most of your European sailing ships weren't all that different from the ships the Greeks used, the triremes, which, if you remember, they have these big square sails, and you have hundreds and hundreds of rowers that sort of push the ship forward when wind can't. A typical European ship in the Mediterranean would be a galley, which is basically the same principle. There's really not much difference at all, actually. But that changes as soon as you have the development of the caravel and the carracks. So first and foremost, caravels have rounded hulls that dip into the ocean as opposed to flat hulls, or what we call flat keels that sort of glide across the ocean. So what this means is that if you hit the open oceans of the Atlantic and Pacific and get a big wave, you're less likely to absolutely capsize. You also have the use of lantine sails that we saw with emerge with the Arabs that can be used to steer the ship. So you don't really need, well, it makes things a lot easier. These are first used by the Spanish and the Portuguese. They're, by the way, the two countries that are sort of leading the charge here, really, especially Portugal during this time period. And then you have the development of the carrack. These are large merchant ships that have 3 or 4 masts, which are basically the pole things in the middle of the ship that have sails. And these are used mainly by Portugal. So also shout out to the Dutch here who come up with a vessel on their own called the Vloot, which is a ship that basically maximizes interior space for extra trade. Now, it's one thing to develop all these new fancy ships, but you kind of gotta know where you're going with them. So that's why the development of things like the magnetic compass or the improved magnetic compass, along with the astrolabe and improved astronomical charts, makes things a lot better and more efficient. You also have map making, which is also improved by the introduction of paper from China. And of course, we have the cannon. Now, at some point in history, not sure when it happened, but we have this philosopher of rednecks in Europe who asked the following question. Gee, I wonder what happens if we stick one of them there cannons on the end of this here ship. And the result is basically a revolution of naval warfare that has existed from that time period all the way to the development of the aircraft carrier. Finally, we get better maps, specifically the Mercator projection, which is developed by a Flemish geographer named Gerardus Kramer, the Merchant, or Gerardus Kramer Mercator. Mercator basically means merchant. So, basically, this is the merchant map, which I think is probably an appropriate summary of the reason it exists and its purpose. So, of course, the weakness is, of course, the fact that at the extreme edges of the poles, things get stretched out, and it looks like Antarctica could take all the rest of the continents combined in a fistfight. Antarctica is the MMA champion of the continents in MMA continental duels. I'm sure that really has a lot of followers. Anyway, that is, of course, if you ever look at the globe, that's not quite accurate. But the purpose really isn't to help you navigate the extreme ends of the globe. The purpose is to give you a pretty good understanding of what's all in here. So that hopefully answers the question of why Europe. Next time, we'll talk about what Europe does with its newfound power. Till next time.